Hello and welcome to what could be a fairly lengthy video. I'm going to try and keep this one brief, but it covers quite a lot of ground potentially. It's a question I first started contemplating when this was raised in a book I was reading last year by the wonderful indigenous American shaman Raven Caldera. The question was, is Joseph trans, or was Joseph trans? The Joseph in question here being the Joseph of the Bible and indeed the Quran. And I hadn't contemplated this question before. I think it can be extended to, was he a gender variant rather than just necessarily trans? Perhaps fluid, someone like myself, or there was something about his gender that isn't very obvious in the first reading, and certainly English translations of scripture. It got me on a path of inquiry, and I think there are a number of areas which are quite interesting to look into. I would say right up front, I do not know the answer. I personally have a very open mind on this, but I find it quite intriguing. So I thought I'd share a little of what I have come across. As I say, quite a lengthy video. Potentially, there are chapter markers enabled for this if you do want to skip to different sections. But now, when you start exploring, there do tend to be, I guess, competing strengths of opinion on this question, depending on who you're reading. Those who are vehemently opposed to the idea and try and defend the scripture, and very much are of that mindset of God created male and female as two binaries, essentially. And there are those, particularly those who perhaps are looking for role models, let's call it within the LGBTQ plus, whatever you want to describe that umbrella as, looking to the Bible for role models. So you will get two quite polarized points of view. But amidst all this, there's quite a lot of scholarly writing as well, which I'm particularly drawn upon, and also dipping quite a lot into Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. So the basics, and these will form the chapter headings, I hope, if it works out in YouTube. The basics are, let's look at the purpose of his coat and what that might say about his gender. Secondly, teachings that come from the Midrash being this authoritative collection of commentaries by rabbis on the Talmud, on aspects of the Old Testament, that talk about Joseph in his youth. Thirdly, what the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, says on Joseph's father, Isaac, having two souls, and there being quite an interesting teaching around Joseph and his sister actually swapping souls when they were in the womb. The question of Joseph's beauty comes up, and there are odd theories about Joseph's preparation for a certain priesthood. I would also add another idea that perhaps Joseph was a shaman of sorts. He was certainly, as we know, a great dreamer and visionary and able to interpret those dreams. So someone that can transcend the different realms, as it were, the heaven and earth, and also with that transcend gender, perhaps. The truth of all this, of course, is that we do not know whether he was trans or not. And I would say also right up front that for me, the reason that Joseph, his story, appears in Genesis, we're told quite a lot about him, and there's also quite a lot in the Quran as well, really has probably very little to do with gender. It's much more about explaining God's plan for what became the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph's was one of those first tribes, and the plan to move that group into Egypt for a period being a part of God's plan. And of course, the characteristics of Joseph and his relationship with his brothers and his father, his loyalty, his dedication, his vision, all of those things, many teachings that will come through our reading from that are much more important, I think, than who he was as in terms of his gender. So you probably know the story. Just a quick recap: Joseph, and there are slight variations in the details of what appear in the Quran and what appear in Jewish and Christian writings, in other words, in the Old Testament. But Joseph was one of Jacob's 12 sons. And we're told that his father loved him more than any other and gave him this beautiful colored cloak as a gift. His brothers were jealous of him, and actually, some of them wanted to kill him, but in the end, he was sold off into slavery, taken to Egypt, and eventually became a steward to one of Pharaoh's officials, Potiphar. There's the story about Potiphar's wife being very jealous of Joseph, unsuccessfully trying to seduce him, making false accusations, and as a result, Joseph was imprisoned. But due to his ability to interpret dreams, and specifically dreams that Pharaoh was having, he ultimately was made governor of Egypt and wisely rationed the country's produce in preparation for what he foresaw to be a time of terrible famine. And it was during that time of famine, when Egypt was able to survive, that Jacob's sons came to Egypt, not knowing that it was actually their brother, who was then the chief vizier, pleading with him for supplies. They didn't recognize him. But after he was satisfied that they were reformed, he identified himself and invited his father to return, and all his brothers to return with him and settle in Egypt. In the Old Testament, the story is told in Genesis, around about chapter 37 to, or is it 39 through to 45. And he's often seen in Christian teaching, at least, as being an Old Testament equivalent, or a prefiguration, if you like, of Christ himself. A very important character who demonstrates these qualities of loyalty, of not being seduced, tempted, of being faithful to his family, of being able to forgive, and so on. So let's look at some of these aspects that some say may point to Joseph having a transnature, and perhaps the foremost amongst these is the question of his coat, which actually isn't mentioned in the Quran at all, by the way, and it gets only a very brief reading in the Bible. More is said in the Midrash, so these rabbinic teachings that are said to have great authority in Judaism. And in these teachings, the coat, which in Hebrew, and forgive me because I do not know Hebrew and pronunciation will be wrong here, is ketanet pasim, which is translated in various ways, usually not as a coat of many colors. It was known to be a bright coat, a long-sleeved garment, and in Midrash, this is seen as being quite significant. This term, ketanet pasim, this cloak, if you like, is only mentioned in one other place in the Bible, and it was worn by a virgin princess, the daughter of King David, Tamar. And that occurs, I think, probably in around about 1,000 years after, I believe, the time of Joseph. So some significant time after that. Someone will come back to one of the very interesting theorists on Joseph, is actually, of all people, not only a theologian, but a theoretical physicist as well, Russian theoretical physicist and Kabbalist, in other words, studies the Kabbalah, Alexander Poltorak. Now, he says that this expression, ketanet pasim, can be translated in many different ways, beyond coat of many colors. For example, as a striped tunic, as a tunic of wool, or a long coat. But it's a little bit ambiguous. And it's in the book of Samuel where we read, second book of Samuel, chapter 13, where we read about this again in the case of Tamar, and therefore Poltorak directly identifies this as a dress worn by a virgin daughter of a king. Another interesting commentary here is a Quaker minister, Ashley M. Wilcox, who said that the idea that Joseph's coat had many colors actually comes from Greek and Latin translations of the original scripture of the Talmud. He says that Joseph wasn't wearing a rainbow coat. He was wearing a princess's coat. Now, that, of course, is open to question. We don't know. We could say, well, Tamar just wearing a coat that was given to someone who was destined for priesthood or whatever. We don't know. But that is one interpretation. Now, some theories suggest that the coat signified Joseph being named as Jacob's heir, and a mark of Jacob's favoritism for him, or preparing him for priesthood, possibly due to Joseph being the firstborn of Rachel. Jacob had, I think, 4 wives in total, and Rachel was his last. There's also a theory around its marking out a particular status. So this idea of the coat possibly marking out a special status and destiny, as it were, for Joseph. Some, particularly those who look for role models in LGBTQ role models in the Bible, suggest, and this is particularly obviously more modern interpretations, that the coat and behavior could be read as expressions of a queer or gender non-conforming identity. There's also an idea that the cloak might have some symbolic purpose, that it may have what's called a beged, a garment that imparts significance to the wearer, rather than, in Hebrew, a levush, clothing used to hide or cover up the body. And there's also a theory, more of a sort of psychological theory, this one, that suggests the coat might have been a way for Joseph to project confidence and cover insecurities, possibly stemming from growing up without his mother, Rachel, who died early on in his life. However, some of these theories are, of course, disputed. One blogger I came across suggested that even the coat that Tamar wore might not have been the same type or had the same significance as Joseph. Of course, we don't know that. That it was, more than anything, a gift of honor. And that whatever the tunic looked like, it marked out Jacob's special affection for Joseph. And on the question of Jacob giving this coat as a special gift, this same blogger asked what I think is a very valid question. If it was something that was seen as feminine, it would be an odd display of special affection for Jacob to give Joseph a girl's coat in a society where he would have been ridiculed for it. And they also mentioned that what we read, at least in the English translations of the Bible, is that his brothers didn't tease him for wearing the coat. They were jealous of him. And again, this blogger is saying, well, if they were jealous, doubtless they weren't all aspiring cross-dressers. So an open question there, an interesting one. My little theory around the shaman. Raven Caldera, the shaman whose wonderful book, Hermaphrodites, got me thinking about this question, pointed to this possibility. Shamans, of course, in many cultures, cross gender in their work. They shapeshift in order to gain power, and the transgenders we know in quite a number of indigenous cultures particularly are automatically become shaman and are particularly revered. So this idea that a shaman is a walker between worlds, and that embraces both male and female. We're talking about a world in which spirit is really what matters. And this possibility of changing from one gender to another, according to Caldera, almost seems as though it's treated like a dress rehearsal, as he calls it, for moving from one plane of reality to another. So if Shaman, whatever name you give them, have existed throughout history, perhaps it was the case that Joseph fits the bill here. He was certainly someone who had very strong, vivid dreams. And these were announced very early on to his father, that he would become very great. Joseph would become very great. And his father advised him to keep quiet about that, essentially. But we must assume Jacob possibly recognized this role for Joseph, and maybe that's a part of what he was encouraging. On the question of priestesses, this coat being associated with a royal priestess, again referring to what Caldera again suggests, that way back in ancient times, there were likely women, men, and transgendered, male to females, among this number. Respected, again, very much like the shaman duty, as a sacred practice, considered to embody the goddess and bring her favor upon worshippers. And Caldera points to a tradition of secret priests and priestesses who were also prostitutes coming from Greece and Mesopotamia, where the Kadishtu and the Kadishem, these were genetic female and transgendered priestesses, regularly included sacred sex work in the temples of Inanna, Ishtar, Ashtoreth, Atireth, and Tanith, so these great goddesses. The great mother of the successive waves, if you like, of the conquerors of Mesopotamia. Some of the males were castrated, all were written as being feminine. And these prostitutes apparently wore a multicolored costume reminiscent of the cloak we read about Joseph being given. So there is some suggestion among some that Joseph's father may have recognized this as a destiny for him, and Jacob supported that in giving him the coat, and that he was actually seemingly killed, at least shut out of the family, excluded from the family by his brothers, as it were, to preserve the family's honor. Again, that's a theory I'm presenting. I'm not saying that is right or wrong, because I do not know. But certainly there was a tradition of these sacred priests and priestesses, prostitutes in Mesopotamia. Now, another interesting line of inquiry here is to look at what the Midrash, these rabbinic commentaries, have to say about Joseph in his youth, and whether there's anything there around his gender. Several Midrashic teachings do discuss Joseph's gender presentation and behavior in his youth, so suggesting quite a complex and potentially non-conforming gender identity. And they paint a picture of Joseph as a figure with quite complex gender expressions in his youth that wouldn't have been typically characteristic of males of his time. So one of the rabbis interprets the phrase "vehu nacha," and he was a youngster in Genesis, as indicating that Joseph engaged in childish things, tending his eyes, lifting his heels, primping his hair. So a suggestion there possibly that Joseph engaged in feminine or non-conforming behavior for a 17-year-old male of that period. And that same Midrash allows for an alternative reading of this Hebrew term for childish acts, ma'asath na'arat, as ma'asa nararot, activities of girls, again, perhaps further hinting at this kind of non-conforming behavior. Now, that is the interpretation of a rabbi albeit an esteemed one, whether that was an inspired interpretation or not, and what interpretation could be put around the Hebrew, I don't know. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'm just offering this as another line of inquiry into this intriguing question. There's also, in Kabbalah especially, a very, very interesting theory that Joseph and his sister Dinah swapped souls when they were in the womb, with Joseph initially being conceived as a girl and moving into a boy's body in the uterus. So according to one teaching on Genesis chapter 30, verse 21, this is from the Midrash Targum Pseudo Jonathan. When Leah became pregnant for the seventh time, she prayed that the child would be female to avoid Rachel having fewer sons than the concubines. And as a result of this prayer, the fetuses in Leah's and Rachel's wombs were switched. Joseph was placed in Rachel's womb while Dinah was placed in Leah's womb. This particular Midrash is cited in a number of different Jewish sources, and some interpretations suggest it involved not just a physical exchange, but also a transformation of gender and of souls. And as a result, it's used to explain these apparent expressions of character behavior that Joseph is described as having later in his life, in his youth. Now, it's very important, of course, to note that there are variations of interpretation of this particular Midrash, with some sources suggesting different timings or involving other siblings. However, this core concept of Joseph and Dinah swapping souls in the womb is really quite significant, apparently, in rabbinic literature and Jewish mystical thought. Now, on the question of beauty, or perhaps perceived feminine beauty, this comes up quite a lot. Joseph is described in the Bible as being beautiful, attractive. He attracts Potiphar's wife. There is a charisma about him. There is some quality that makes him attractive, and he quickly finds his feet, as it were, in Egypt. The Talmud and the Midrash emphasize his beauty and its power to attract others. Whereas elsewhere in the Bible and other scriptures, that's a trait more commonly associated with women. He's also sometimes shown this way in artistic interpretations. For example, one academic, Karen Hugel of the University of Amsterdam, observes of Michelangelo's fresco in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, Jacob and Joseph, that what she calls the beautiful, effeminate Joseph, Jacob's son, can be understood as a quasi-queer ancestor of Jesus Christ. Again, that's just one interpretation. And of course, as always, we can make of our interpretations what we will, perhaps sometimes twisting them to what we want to make them. So I just offer that as a point of view. But some Jewish teaching says that Joseph is the image of his beautiful mother, with the coat, again, potentially emphasizing a connection to Rachel's beauty. Now, when I read about his beauty in the Bible, and I don't know the Hebrew here, what the original meaning was, I sense it's perhaps more to do with a quality that is recognized in Joseph. It is his manner, his nature, his goodness, his righteousness, and something divine within him. Possibly something that transcends gender, but again, I wouldn't say that the gender aspect is really necessarily particularly relevant. It's personality, for want of a better word, charisma that is coming through, that is really drawing attention. And I do wonder if what we might see as feminine behavior today, so for example, if reading from the Queer Bible commentary, some rabbis said, he painted his eyes and walked with mincing step, showing off the coat of many colors, twirling, hugging himself. And he goes on to say that he is a flaming young queen, and no wonder his brothers, particularly the sons of Leia, hate him. Well, maybe that's putting a bit of a modern interpretation on it, whether that behavior would have been seen as especially effeminate back in the day, I've no idea. I think we've got to be careful about applying gender stereotypes that we might recognize today to this time very early on in Israel's history. Now, apart from these more common questions that come up, you'll find quite easily doing a Google search around the question of whether Joseph was trans or gender non-conforming. I came across a very interesting article. I put the link in the description by the Russian theoretical physicist Alexander Poltorek, who's also a student of Kabbalah. And Kabbalah, I have studied a little bit myself. I have spent some time with that and tried to understand at least some of the Hebrew characters and so on. This is Jewish mysticism. So if if you're not into Kabbalah or don't believe it, then look away now, I guess, really. But if you are, it can be quite intriguing, some of the theories that are there. Poltorek says that he believes that there is a great mystery hidden beneath the surface of the story of Joseph. He goes on again about the Kabbalist theory that when Isaac was born, he received the female half of his soul, having, as it were, both female and male souls in one body, which is why he could not get married. I guess we should look at Isaac as potentially being transgender as well. If that's the case, that could be quite an interesting question that I've not really explored. But according to at least some Kabbalists, as they're called, students of Kabbalah, Yahweh God had to orchestrate what's called the Akida, the binding of Isaac, to swap his soul. And Poltorek suggests that it's possible that a similar process went on, which underlies the killing, or at least the expulsion of Joseph from the family by his brothers, this idea of getting rid of him. He goes on to suggest that because Jacob had this deep love for Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, a miracle given their age at the time, that he kind of overlooked, love is blind, if you like, he overlooked any feminine expression that Joseph had. It was very much more a pure kind of love that he had. And I guess we could say, well, if his elder brothers or half brothers hated him, perhaps because of his effeminacy, and of course, because of the way that Jacob showed him special favor, perhaps they were early transphobes. They didn't think it was seemly to have someone expressing effeminate behavior within their family. Maybe, and this is Poltorek's suggestion, the elder brothers also knew that a similar situation had already taken place in the family with their grandfather Isaac, again, who'd received the female aspect of the soul at birth, and this process of Akida being necessary to restore his masculinity. And they might then, this again is conjecture, have decided that a similar procedure was needed to restore masculinity as they saw it for Joseph. And maybe that's why they decided to throw him into the pit. Now, Kabbalah, among other things, has an interesting study of what's called gematria. This is numerology and numbers and significance that is placed on Hebrew characters particularly. I won't go into this in detail. The article covers this a lot. It's quite complex. But the gematria of Joseph, the number, if you like, is one less apparently than the gematria of the Hebrew nukfar, which is the female principle in godliness. And he goes on to really analyze what was going on here. The idea was that the brothers wanted to strip off this extra element, which they did before they cast him into the pit. So in other words, simplifying what the Gematria says, I say there's a lot of detail in this. What they were trying to do there was strip away Joseph's femininity as they saw it, and therefore enable him to achieve his destiny. Now, in Kabbalah, there are also a lot of references, what are known as the Sephirah or Sephirot, emanations of divinity, which appear in the Tree of Life. And the 10 brothers before Joseph are said to represent, personify each of these Sephirah. And that each of them personify one Sephirah of the feminine parts of Nukva, whereas Joseph personified Yesod, the masculine parts of Zia and Pin. And so there was a conflict there between the interpretations of masculine and feminine presentation. The theory goes on, I won't get into detail about this, that Joseph himself kind of had a conversion. He becomes fully masculine, as it were, certainly by the time he's in Egypt and is vizier to Pharaoh. And when the brothers visit with Benjamin, Joseph tests Benjamin to see whether the masculine principle is alive within him. He passes that test, seemingly. So this idea that if he had experienced gender ambiguity in his youth, Joseph was concerned about his younger brother experiencing similar issues, and was relieved to find out that that wasn't the case. That is the theory. And certainly Joseph goes on to live to a good age and to see his grandchildren. He is, of course, one of the heads, the origin, the forefather, or the original father, I should say, of one of the tribes of Israel. So, trying to draw some conclusions from all of this. As I said earlier, for me, the story of Joseph is primarily about his righteousness, it's about his loyalty, about his character. It's not about gender. And all of these theories are just theories. The Midrash may have quite a lot of authority for some, and particularly some of the interpretations of Kabbalah. But of course, that's not going to be something that's widely accepted by many. We can always, of course, read into any story what we want, particularly if we are looking for role models ourselves and not finding too many of them in the Bible, for example. So this question, was Joseph trans or gender non-conforming, is still open for me. I mean, there seems to be quite a lot, these different lines of theory that really do suggest it was a strong possibility that he was. And I find it quite intriguing that a very prominent trans character, someone, as we mentioned earlier, who's sometimes seen as a precursor to the Christ, might feature in Genesis. But whatever, even if he was trans, ambiguous, or transcended gender as a shaman, it only really seems important to know that he was much loved by God and very happily also much loved by his physical father on earth, Jacob.